The cameras were already rolling. That was the part no one talked about afterward, the part that made everything worse, or depending on who you ask, everything more permanent. Los Angeles, 1967. The studio lights were blinding white, the kind that flatten shadows and expose everything, the kind you cannot hide from. A talk show, a live audience, roughly 200 people packed into velvet seats, fanning themselves with programs, laughing at the warm-up comedians' jokes, completely unaware that in approximately 4 minutes they were about to witness something that television was never designed to capture. Something that would be whispered about for decades in gyms, in dojos, in late-night conversations between men who really understood what it meant to be fast. The guest before Bruce Lee was still taking his bow, and in the green room, a man named Victor Kral was cracking his knuckles. Victor Kral was not famous. That was the problem. He was, by most accounts, enormously talented. Czechoslovakian by birth, a former European heavyweight wrestling champion who had emigrated to California, chasing the dream that every large, physically gifted man chases, that somewhere in America his size would finally become currency. He stood 6'3", 238 pounds of dense architectural muscle. His neck was wider than most men's thighs. His handshake, people said, felt like being caught in a machine. He had spent 3 years on the fringes of Hollywood stunt work, bit parts, background roles, always the body double, never the star. And then Bruce Lee happened. Not to Victor specifically, to everyone, to the entire industry. Suddenly, this 135-pound Chinese-American man with impossible reflexes was becoming the most talked-about martial artist in California. Studios were calling, producers were circling, the word phenomenon kept appearing in trade papers next to a photo of a man who, by Victor's estimation, he could simply pick up and place somewhere else. Victor had made the mistake that large men have made since the beginning of recorded history. He had confused weight with force. He had confused size with speed. And he had done something worse than either of those errors. He had said it out loud, publicly, to a producer he knew at a party in the hills 3 weeks before this television appearance. He had laughed, that big barrel-chested laugh, and said, "Bruce Lee? I'll show you Bruce Lee. Put us in a room together, any room. I'll do it for free." The producer, as producers do, had seen opportunity. Not for Victor. Victor was the instrument. The story was Bruce Lee's reaction. So they booked them both on the same episode. Bruce Lee walked onto the set the way he always walked into rooms. Not slowly, not quickly, precisely. Every step measured without appearing measured. His posture was the posture of a man who had already assessed every exit, every distance, every variable in the space, and had found none of them threatening. He wore a simple black shirt, no jacket, no armor. The host, a slicked-haired man named Don Carmichael, who specialized in the kind of charm that makes you trust people you shouldn't, welcomed Bruce with the practiced warmth of someone who already knew what was coming. The audience applauded. Bruce sat down, crossed one leg over the other, smiled, and from the opposite wing of the stage, Victor Kral walked out. The reaction was immediate. The audience didn't applaud so much as intake breath. The man was simply enormous. He filled the doorframe. He sat in the guest chair, and the chair looked borrowed from a different, smaller world. Don Carmichael leaned forward with his showman's grin. "Victor, you've made some bold claims about tonight's guest." Victor smiled, the smile of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. "I have enormous respect for Bruce, but the respect doesn't change physics. I have 100 pounds on him, maybe more. The body doesn't lie." Light laughter from the audience. Bruce Lee said nothing. He was looking at Victor with an expression that was almost curiosity, the way a chess grandmaster looks at an opponent who has just made a move they find interesting. "And you believe that size gives you an advantage?" Carmichael prodded. "I believe that if I wrap both hands around that man's waist, I can throw him across this stage before he can do anything about it. This is not an insult. This is simple mechanics." More laughter.
Louder now. Someone in the back row whooped. Bruce Lee uncrossed his leg. He leaned forward just slightly, and for the first time in the exchange, he spoke. "Would you like to try?"
The laughter stopped, not gradually, immediately, as if someone had pulled a plug from the wall. Don Carmichael blinked. His smile flickered. Victor stared. Whatever script he had prepared in his mind, whatever sequence of confident quips and dismissive body language he had rehearsed, it had not included this, had not included Bruce Lee inviting it, right here, right now, on live television with 200 people watching and cameras rolling. Because here is what Victor had expected. He had expected Bruce Lee to smile, to deflect, to demonstrate a kick on a pad, perhaps, or break a board, or perform one of the exhibition tricks that martial artists did on television to satisfy audiences who wanted spectacle without consequence. He had not expected an open door. The producer in the booth upstairs leaned toward his mic and said nothing. He understood, in that animal way that television people develop, that whatever was happening right now was more valuable than anything he could manufacture. Victor looked at the audience. The audience looked at Victor. 200 people, all of them doing the same arithmetic, this enormous man, that small one, and arriving at the same comfortable conclusion. Victor stood up. He was even larger standing. The lights caught the architecture of his shoulders. Someone in the second row whispered something to their neighbor. Bruce Lee did not stand immediately. He sat for exactly 3 more seconds, 3 seconds that would be analyzed, replicated, and argued about in martial arts circles for the next 50 years, and then he rose. He was standing, not much to look at, by Victor's shoulder, barely, his arms, his waist, his entire frame suggesting a man who had no business being in this equation. That was, of course, the entire point. The floor manager made a decision. Later, he would say he didn't remember making it, that it simply happened, the way decisions happen when you're running on instinct and adrenaline. He widened the camera shot, pulled back the second camera to capture both men at once. He wanted the scale of it on screen. He got something else entirely. Victor raised both enormous hands, palms out, demonstrating, for the audience's benefit, or perhaps for his own, the tools he intended to use. Each hand was roughly the size of a dinner plate. His fingers alone had more mass than Bruce Lee's wrists. "No striking," Victor said. "I simply grab. You try to stop me." He was smiling again. The smile was back. The audience liked it. They were warming to him, this big, affable European, this gentle giant who was about to prove a point about physics. He took 1 step forward. That was all he managed. What happened next was documented in the days that followed by approximately a dozen people who had been in that studio audience and felt compelled to tell someone. Their accounts varied in detail, as eyewitness accounts always do, but they agreed unanimously on several specific things. The speed. Everyone mentioned the speed first. It wasn't like watching a person move. One audience member, a retired gym teacher named Margaret Hooper, told her son that night. It was like watching film skip a frame. Victor's hand reached forward, the grab that was supposed to be simple, inevitable, mechanical. And Bruce Lee was no longer where he had been. Not to the side, not backward, forward. He moved forward and beneath Victor's extended arm in a single motion, so compressed it registered in the human eye as almost a single frame, a blur that rearranged itself into a different position than where it had started. His left hand redirected Victor's grabbing arm, not blocked, not pushed, redirected. The difference between those 3 words is the difference between a wall and a river. Victor's momentum, all 238 pounds of it, continued in the direction it had been traveling, but the target had ceased to exist there. In the same motion, the same instant, Bruce Lee's right hand was positioned, open-palmed, 2 inches from Victor's solar plexus. He did not strike. He stopped. Victor stumbled slightly from his own forward momentum. He looked down, processed the geography of what had just occurred, looked at the open hand hovering near his midsection with the same expression a man has when he realizes the car he was certain would stop didn't. 3 seconds. From Victor's step forward to this moment, 3 seconds. The audience made no sound.
Not the held-breath silence of anticipation, the deeper silence of something that the brain needs an extra moment to process. The silence that follows something the eye has seen, but the mind has not yet certified as real. Victor straightened slowly. Bruce Lee lowered his hand. He was not breathing hard. He had not adjusted his shirt. His expression was precisely what it had been before, that quality of mild curiosity, as if the experiment had yielded exactly the data he expected and he was simply noting it down. He looked at Victor, not triumphantly, not with cruelty. He looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who had just understood something difficult. "Again?" Bruce Lee said. Victor Kral was not a foolish man. Whatever propelled him onto this stage, ego, ambition, the particular blindness that physical domination produces in men who have never been stopped, it had not removed his intelligence. He had a body that had been tested in real competition against real opponents, and some part of that body now understood what the mind was still catching up to. His arm tingled where Bruce Lee's hand had redirected it, not from pain, from something more unsettling, the recognition that the force applied had been effortless, that he had been moved without being moved, controlled without being touched with hostility. He sat back down. The audience exhaled. Don Carmichael, who had been standing to the side of the set with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition, made his way back to his chair. "Well," he said, and then he said nothing else for a moment, because there was genuinely nothing adequate to append to that syllable. Victor looked at his own hands, then at Bruce Lee, who had already settled back into his chair, crossed his leg again, resumed the posture of a man at complete rest. "How—" stopped, started again. "How is that possible?" And Bruce Lee smiled, not the performer's smile, not the movie star's smile, something quieter and more genuine. "Because I don't fight your body, I fight your intention."
The cameras were still rolling. That line, "I don't fight your body, I fight your intention," landed in that studio the way certain sentences land when they are spoken by the right person at the right moment in the right room. Not as philosophy, not as performance, as fact. Victor sat with it. The audience sat with it. Don Carmichael, a man professionally trained to fill silence, sat with it. Because the thing about watching what they had just watched, that 3-second rearrangement of the laws of physical expectation, was that it had made the sentence visible. Most people hear wisdom and it passes through them like light through glass, but when the wisdom follows a demonstration that the eyes cannot fully explain, something different happens. It lodges. It stays. Victor's hand had reached forward. The universe, Victor understood, said that hand would find what it was looking for. Bruce Lee had not fought the hand. He had not fought the arm. He had not fought Victor's strength or his weight or his reach. He had read, in the fraction of a second before Victor's intention became action, exactly where that intention was traveling, and he had simply declined to be there. This was not a trick. This was not a technique you could find in a manual or a syllabus or the back pages of a martial arts magazine. This was something that lived at the outer edge of what dedicated, obsessive, relentless practice produces in a human body after enough years. Something that looks supernatural only because most people never practice anything long enough to understand that the supernatural is just the natural, compressed. Bruce Lee, sitting in that chair under those white lights, was the product of 10,000 hours, so precisely applied that they had ceased to be hours and become instinct. Victor knew it now, in his hands, in his arm, in that animal part of the nervous system that understands danger independent of the ego's permission. He would not reach forward again. The show continued for another 18 minutes. They talked about the Green Hornet. They talked about the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, the style Bruce was developing, the style that wasn't quite a style, that was more a framework for dismantling all styles. They talked about Hollywood, about representation, about what it meant to be Chinese American in an industry that had spent decades deciding what roles men who looked like Bruce Lee were permitted to occupy. Victor laughed at one of Bruce's jokes, genuinely, the laugh of a man who has been recalibrated. When the taping ended, when
When the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out into the Los Angeles evening, still processing what they had witnessed, Victor found Bruce Lee in the corridor backstage. He was alone. Bruce was talking to one of the camera operators, gesturing with his hands the way he always did when explaining something, using his body as punctuation. Victor waited until the conversation finished. Then he walked over. He was quieter than he had been on stage. The performance was gone. What remained was something more honest, a large man with a question he wasn't sure he knew how to ask. "I want to understand," he said. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. That same assessment, that same quiet reading of intention. "Come to the gym," Bruce said. "Thursday, 7 in the morning." That was all. He handed Victor a card with an address on it, picked up the bag he had left against the wall, and walked toward the exit. Victor stood in that corridor holding a small card and understanding, in a way he had never understood anything physical before, that he had spent his entire life learning how to be large and had never once considered learning how to be precise. Word moves differently in closed industries. In Hollywood, in 1967, the martial arts community was small, tight-knit in the way of people who share something the general public doesn't yet value. Stuntmen, choreographers, the handful of actors who trained seriously rather than decoratively. By the following morning, the story had traveled. Not the broadcast version. The cameras had captured the geography of the moment, not the texture, not the thing you could only feel if you had been in the room. The story spreading through phone calls and diner conversations and gym floors was the eyewitness version. The 200 people who had been in those velvet seats, each of them carrying a slightly different piece of the same astonishment. A stuntman named Carroll heard it from a grip who had been working the studio that night. He called a trainer he knew in Burbank. The trainer told 2 fighters he was working with. One of them told his brother. Within 72 hours, the specific geometry of what Bruce Lee had done, the forward movement instead of the retreat, the redirection without resistance, the open palm that stopped 2 inches short, was being dissected by people who understood enough about fighting to recognize that what they were hearing was not exaggeration. It was understatement. Because the people telling the story kept hitting the same wall when they tried to convey it. You had to be there. Not because it was unbelievable, because it was one of those moments where the gap between watching something and understanding it collapses, where the body teaches the mind something that language can only approximate. A producer at Warner Brothers heard a version of the story at lunch. He wrote a note to himself on a napkin. The note said simply, "Lee, find out what he wants." James Coburn heard it at a dinner party in the hills and laughed, not dismissively, but the way a man laughs when a story confirms something he has always believed. Chuck Norris, who was teaching at his school in Torrance and had sparred with Bruce enough times to not be surprised by anything involving his speed, simply nodded when someone told him, "Yeah, that sounds right." Here is the thing about that moment that never made it into any account, any retelling, any of the documentary footage and biographical chapters that would eventually accumulate around Bruce Lee's life like geological layers. Victor Kral reached forward with his right hand, standard grab, collar or shoulder, the instinctive target for a wrestling-trained man initiating a dominant position. Bruce Lee was not where Victor's hand arrived. But here is the detail that the studio audience didn't catch, that the camera angle obscured, that only the people standing in the wings, 3 stagehands, the floor manager, and a makeup artist named Sandra, who had been with the show for 4 years, actually saw. In the same fraction of a second that Bruce moved forward and beneath the grabbing arm, his left hand had not simply redirected Victor's wrist, it had found the precise pressure point along the inside of Victor's forearm, a location that, when engaged correctly, sends an involuntary signal down the arm's nervous pathway, and applied exactly enough pressure to briefly interrupt the grip Victor intended to form. It was over before Victor's brain had registered it had begun. Victor had not been thrown, he had not been struck, he had not, by any visible metric, been harmed. He had simply been made briefly, in the most targeted, surgical, unfindable way, unable to do the thing he intended to do. Sandra, the makeup artist, told her husband about it that night. He didn't believe her. She told him again, in detail, and he still didn't believe her. "People don't move like that," he said. "I know," she said, "but he does."
He went. Of course he went. A man who has been shown the edge of what he thought was a complete map, he goes to find what's beyond it. Thursday, 7 in the morning. A gym in Culver City that smelled of canvas and liniment and the particular history of rooms where serious work happens. Bruce Lee was already there when Victor arrived, already moving, the kind of fluid, low-intensity warm-up that looks casual until you try to replicate it and discover that every motion is actually a precision instrument. They trained for 2 hours. Victor was never entirely comfortable talking about what happened in those 2 hours. The few times he mentioned it in later years, he described it not as a lesson, but as a dismantling, a systematic, kind, completely relentless examination of every physical assumption Victor had built his body around. Bruce showed him the difference between power generated from mass and power generated from position. He demonstrated on Victor's own body, using Victor's own resistance, how a force applied at the precise angle against a joint's weakest vector requires almost no strength at all. He showed him that speed is not the movement of the body, it is the elimination of everything in the movement that is unnecessary. Victor left that gym and drove home in silence. His hands were on the steering wheel, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, back in that gym, turning over those 2 hours the way you turn over a new language, finding that the words you thought you knew had shifted meaning. He never did the television circuit again, never made the boastful claims again. He did, however, begin training differently. 3 years later, at 36 years old, past the age when most large physical men accept that their bodies have given them everything they're going to give, Victor Kral earned a black belt in Jeet Kune Do concepts. He told the instructor that he had wanted it since a Thursday morning in 1967. The 200 people who sat in those velvet seats each took something different out of that studio. Some took a story, the kind you tell at dinner parties when the conversation drifts to the unexplainable. Some took a memory, the specific, physical, cellular memory of watching something that made the stomach drop in the way that truth sometimes does, suddenly and without warning. Some took a question, the question that Bruce Lee seemed to generate everywhere he went, in every room he entered, a question that his presence made inescapable. What would it mean to be that good at something? Not famous, not celebrated, not successful by any of the metrics the city outside those studio walls was organized around. Simply that good, that refined, that completely and utterly in possession of a single truth, and that truth being so thoroughly practiced, so absolutely embodied, that the body could express it in 3 seconds in front of 200 strangers under white lights with cameras rolling. What would it cost? What would it require? What would you have to give up, and what would you have to give everything to? These were not comfortable questions. They were the kind that follow you home and sit in the corner of the room. Bruce Lee asked them without speaking a word. He asked them by simply being what he was, standing in front of Victor Kral's reaching hand and choosing, in a fraction of a second, exactly what to do with it. He died 5 years later, 32 years old, July 1973, a circumstance that medicine still debates and mythology has never stopped arguing over. He left behind films that changed cinema, a philosophy that changed martial arts,
a body of work that, 50 years on, continues to generate exactly the conversation it always generated in his lifetime. How was that possible? The answer is always the same, and it is never satisfying to people who want the answer to be supernatural. He practiced, he studied, he questioned every assumption that martial arts had calcified into tradition, stripped each technique to its core mechanical truth, and rebuilt everything from the foundation up. He trained when he didn't feel like it. He trained when he did feel like it. He made his body a laboratory and ran the same experiments thousands of times until the experiments stopped being experiments and became reflex. He understood, in the way that very few people in any discipline ever truly understand, that mastery is not the accumulation of technique, it is the elimination of everything that isn't essential. Victor's hand reached forward in that studio. The universe Victor believed in said large thing finds small thing. Bruce Lee had spent his entire life building a different universe, one where size was a variable, not a constant, where strength was a starting point, not a ceiling, where the body that showed up to a confrontation was less important than the mind that arrived with it, reading intention, reading distance, reading the precise geometry of what was about to happen. 200 people saw it happen in real time. None of them ever forgot it. The footage for years was believed to be lost, one of dozens of conoscopy recordings from that era that were taped over, misfiled, or simply discarded by networks that didn't yet understand what they had captured. Whether it still exists somewhere, in a storage facility or a private collection, or a digital archive waiting to be properly cataloged, nobody knows for certain. But the people who were in that room, they don't need the footage. They carry it differently than film carries anything. They carry it the way the body carries knowledge that bypassed the mind entirely, the way Victor's arm carried what it had learned before his brain had finished processing the lesson. In the muscles, in the nerves, in that deep, wordless place where the body files the things it has genuinely felt. Bruce Lee once said that the height of cultivation runs to simplicity. He didn't mean simple as in easy, he meant simple as in essential, stripped to the single true thing, the thing that remains when everything unnecessary has been removed. That night in Los Angeles, under those white lights, in front of 200 people who had come expecting a television program, he showed them what that looked like. One step forward, one redirection, one open palm held 2 inches from the center of a much larger man's chest. 3 seconds, and a room that never quite went back to believing what it had believed before. If this story moved something in you, if you felt that gap between what you expected and what actually happened, then you already understand what Bruce Lee was trying to teach. Subscribe, because the stories that don't make the history books, the ones that lived in rooms and traveled through whispers and changed the people who witnessed them, those are the ones worth telling. And there are more of them, many more.